Hello, friends. You know, reality can be quite capricious. It often presents stories that make any Hollywood fantasy pale in comparison. Today, you'll learn how a massive passenger Boeing transformed into a silent glider at an altitude of 12,000 meters due to a schoolboy error in mathematics. Why did an entire city decide to entomb its streets alive and build a new existence right on the rooftops of old houses? And how did one individual manage not just to survive, but to live an additional 60 years after being shot by a firing squad and enduring a final shot to the head? Before we dive in, please give a like and leave a comment. This genuinely helps the channel grow. Now let's get started. Story number 1. A flight that forgot to refuel. You know, we tend to place our trust in technology. We look at those gigantic airliners and think, everything is calculated to the millimeter. There are computers, redundant systems, intelligent algorithms. Yet, on the 23rd of July, 1983, it became clear that even the most advanced computer is powerless against simple human folly and the confusion between liters and gallons. Imagine Canada, at an altitude of 12,000 meters. A brand new Boeing 767, the pride of the fleet, a true marvel of technology with a digital cockpit. On board were 61 passengers and 8 crew members. They were en route from Montreal to Edmonton, serving dinner. Some were reading newspapers, others dozing off. A typical mundane flight routine. Suddenly, a beep. A warning light illuminated in the cockpit, indicating an issue with the left engine fuel pump. The pilots, Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal, frowned. The computer indicated everything was functioning normally, yet the light persisted. They assumed it was a sensor malfunction. How could a new airplane have issues? Then the left engine just cuts off. Listen, that's terrifying. But the Boeing has a second engine. You can fly just fine on one. The pilots began their descent, preparing for an emergency landing in Winnipeg. They were calm. These are professionals. Yet minutes pass, and something that should never happen occurs. Another warning chimes. A long, unpleasant sound that the pilots had never encountered on the simulators. Bam, bam, bam. The second engine failed as well, and then came silence. Not the silence you experience when you turn off the television, but an absolute dead silence at an altitude of 12,000 meters. The aircraft, a behemoth weighing over 100 tons, now plummeted like a brick. The power went out. The screens, those very marvels of technology, went dark. The aircraft was powerless because the generators relied on the engines. The cabin lights cut out, leaving only the sound of wind from outside. Do you know why this happened? It's almost laughable if it weren't so frightening. On the ground, the technicians mixed up the measurement systems. Canada was just transitioning to the metric system. They filled the fuel tanks in liters, while the onboard computer interpreted them as pounds, or vice versa. Essentially, a simple mathematical error at a 5th grade level. And now the aircraft was a hollow shell in the sky. But the passengers had one stroke of luck. Captain Pearson, in his spare time, flew gliders, you know, those small engineless aircraft, and he realized that he didn't have a Boeing at the moment. He simply had a very large, very heavy, and very fast glider. The co-pilot Quintal recalled, "There's an old military base in Gimli nearby. Let's head there," he shouted. They maneuvered the massive aircraft without hydraulics, relying solely on muscle power since the controls had become unresponsive. As they approached Gimli, a small detail emerged that Quintal was unaware of. The base had long been closed, and the runway was now a racetrack for the local auto club. And today, on this Saturday, there was a celebration. Families, children, barbecues, go-kart racing, people grilling sausages and drinking lemonade, while a 100-ton silver death descended silently from the sky upon them. Pearson understood he was too high and traveling too fast. There were no brakes, and the flaps didn't function. If he simply aimed for a landing, he would overshoot the runway and crash into either a forest or the crowd. Then he executed a crazy maneuver, known as wing banking. He positioned the enormous passenger jet sideways to the wind, like a fighter or a sleek glider. Passengers in the cabin saw the ground not below, but through the side windows. The plane plummeted like a rock, losing speed. At the last moment before touching down, he leveled the aircraft. The landing gear deployed under their own weight, but the front strut didn't lock. The plane made contact with the asphalt. People on the ground scattered in terror. Two boys on bicycles pedaled as fast as they ever had, glancing back at the gigantic nose of the aircraft racing right behind them. The Boeing pitched down, the front wheel collapsed, and with a terrifying screech, throwing sparks, it skidded across the concrete. Sparks, dust, smoke, and it came to a stop a few dozen meters away from the barbecue goers. Inside the cabin, there was a grave silence, followed by an explosion of panic. But you know what? No one died. Absolutely no one. A few bruises occurred during evacuation via the inflatable slides. That was the extent of the injuries. Captain Pearson left the cockpit, looked at the worn nose of the airplane, and probably exhaled in such a way that his breath could be heard in space. This story came to be known as the Gimli glider. The aircraft was repaired right at the airfield. It took off 2 days later and served the airline for another 25 years. But this incident remained a lasting reminder. You can build the smartest machine in the world, but if you skipped math class in school, even the sky won't save you. However, sometimes the sky gives second chances, especially if the right person is at the controls. But what happens when the right person isn't present and there's only a crazy idea? The most expensive sawmill in history. Wars typically begin over oil, religion, or land. But sometimes humanity is ready to ignite a third world war over landscaping. Seriously, over a single tree. Let's travel to August 1976, to the border between North and South Korea, the demilitarized zone, the most tense spot on the planet where people watch each other through scopes 24 hours a day. At the center of this zone, right by the bridge of no return, stood Rostopol, a gigantic old poplar tree. And it had one significant problem. During the summer, its dense foliage completely obscured the view between the UN observation post and the checkpoint. American officers could not see their own personnel. This situation was perilous. On the 18th of August, a group of 5 American and South Korean soldiers, armed with regular garden axes, set out to trim the branches, a peaceful, routine task. However, as soon as they began, North Korean soldiers appeared. At first, they simply watched, but then their lieutenant ordered them to stop, claiming that the tree had been planted by the leader himself. The Americans naturally continued, prompting the lieutenant to take off his watch, wrap it in a cloth, place it in his pocket, and command his men, "Kill them." The North Koreans seized the axes from the workers and brutally bludgeoned 2 American officers to death right there, hidden by the branches. The world froze in shock. This was an act of war. President Gerald Ford of the United States was furious. North Korea awaited a counterstrike. Everyone anticipated bombings, tanks, anything at all. Yet, the Americans devised a plan that would come to be known in history as Operation Paul Bunyan. They opted against bombing North Korea. Instead, they were determined to cut down that damn tree, but in such a manner that Kim Il-sung would tremble. 3 days later, on the 21st of August, at dawn, the operation commenced. 2 trucks approached the tree. Engineers emerged with chainsaws, but they were not alone. They were escorted by a Special Forces platoon, 64 soldiers from the South Korean Army. And these were not just regular soldiers. They were Taekwondo masters dressed in armor, equipped with batons and with automatic rifles M16 concealed beneath their clothing. Furthermore, claymore mines were attached to their chests. They were prepared to blow themselves up along with the enemy, but that was just the beginning of the show. In the sky above, 27 American helicopters hovered. A bit higher were Phantom fighter jets and bombers. Even higher in the stratosphere, B-52 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons flew. In the Sea of Japan, the aircraft carrier Midway was stationed, accompanied by a full escort of ships. At the border, 12,000 soldiers had their artillery on full readiness. Picture this scene. A tree stands there. Chainsaws buzz around it, while the entire military might of a superpower is poised to turn half of the peninsula to dust at the sound of a single gunshot. The North Koreans had gathered around 150 of their soldiers armed with rifles near the bridge. They watched as the Americans worked. The roar of helicopters and the whine of saws filled the air. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. One mistake, one nervous breakdown from any soldier, and a nuclear war could have erupted. The engineers worked for 42 minutes. They felled the poplar, leaving just a tall stump as a testament to folly. The North Koreans never dared to attack. They simply stood by and watched as their sacred tree was reduced to sawdust under the gaze of the Armada. The operation concluded without a single shot fired. It was the most expensive tree cutting in human history. Millions of dollars spent on fuel and logistics for one old poplar. The stump remained there until 1987, when it was replaced by a concrete monument. This story serves as a perfect example of how far people are willing to go for their principles. Sometimes, mere words are not sufficient to prove one's point. Sometimes, it is necessary to guide an aircraft carrier. However, if everything here has culminated in farce, the following tale illustrates that human stubbornness can lead not to a display of strength, but to a tragedy that defies logical explanation. Here is story number 4. A flight to a white void. Antarctica, the most beautiful and yet merciless place on Earth. In the late 1970s, an airline decided that simply watching it on television was not enough for people. They introduced weekend flights. Imagine boarding a comfortable aircraft in warm New Zealand, sipping champagne, feasting on lobsters, while eternal ice and icebergs drift by your window. Then the plane circles back and returns you home in time for dinner. Sounds like a dream, right? On the 28th of November 1979, Flight 901 took off from Auckland. There were 257 people on board. The atmosphere was festive. Captain Jim Collins was an experienced pilot, although it was his first trip to Antarctica. Nevertheless, he felt no anxiety. He had a clear flight plan programmed into the onboard computer. The computer served as the brain of the aircraft, and pilots trusted it implicitly. The flight plan was straightforward. Fly to McMurdo Sound, descend for a better view, showcase the sights to the tourists, and return. The route was set over flat ice in the Sound, where there were no obstacles. However, there was one small but crucial detail. The night before the departure, air traffic controllers at the control center had altered the coordinates of one of the waypoints by just a few degrees. They believed they were simply fine-tuning the route, but no one informed the crew. The new coordinates steered the plane not over the safe Sound, but straight toward Mount Erebus, an active volcano rising nearly 4 kilometers high. As the aircraft approached Antarctica, Captain Collins initiated the descent. The clouds were low, but visibility beneath them appeared excellent. At least, that's what they thought. Then, the most fearsome killer in polar latitudes entered the scene, the sectoral whiteout. This optical illusion occurs when sunlight filters through clouds and reflects off the snow at such an angle that shadows disappear, the horizon blurs, and the sky and earth merge into a single milky white canvas. The pilots peered out the window, seeing nothing but smooth white ice ahead. They were confident that they were flying over McMurdo Sound, just as planned. The computer confirmed the course was correct, and their eyes indicated emptiness ahead. In reality, a massive mountain loomed right in front of them, obscuring much of the sky. Its slopes, covered in snow that blended with the clouds, hid the black rocks beneath. The mountain had become invisible to the pilots. They were not flying blind in fog. They were flying in clear weather, straight into a wall their minds refused to acknowledge. A calm voice from the engineer filled the cockpit. "Erebus should be somewhere around here." The captain replied, "Yes, I'm trying to spot it now." He was looking straight at it and failed to see it. Just seconds before impact, the warning alarm for dangerous proximity to the ground sounded. Beep, beep, pull up. Captain Collins reacted immediately. He pushed the engines to full power and pulled the yoke toward him, but the massive aircraft had inertia, needing time to respond. At 1350, the plane collided with the slope of Mount Erebus. Instant death for all 257 individuals. The rescuers who arrived at the scene were met with a horrifying sight. A dark streak of soot marred the pristine white snow, resembling a marker drawn across a sheet of paper. The passengers' watches, discovered at the site, continued to tick away the time that their owners would never experience again. The investigation was lengthy and fraught with controversy. The airline attempted to shift blame onto the pilots, claiming they had descended below the permissible altitude. However, Judge Peter Mahan, who presided over the case, uttered his famous remark about the organized flight of deceit. He demonstrated that the pilots had been trapped by altered coordinates without any warning. This disaster transformed aviation, but even more alarmingly, it reveals the peril of normalcy. People did not perish due to storms or engine failures. They lost their lives because their eyes and minds misled them, crafting an illusion of a horizon where death loomed. Sometimes, what we see with our own eyes is the greatest deception. And if here, nature concealed danger in a blanket of white, in the next story, the threat emerged from an unexpected place, from a childhood dream that turned into a nightmare. Story number 5. The most drunken war in history. We are accustomed to thinking of war as bloodshed, mud, and tragedy. But somewhere at the edge of the world, amidst the Arctic ice, a conflict waged for nearly half a century, where the primary weapon was not bullets, but bottles of fine spirits. Imagine a piece of rock in the middle of an icy strait, Hans Island, a tiny lifeless expanse the size of a football field. No nifty resources, no gold, not even a patch of decent grass, just rocks and wind. Yet it sits precisely between Greenland, which belongs to Denmark, and Canada. And then, in 1984, patience ran out. Canada declared, "This is ours." They deployed troops to the island, and soldiers hoisted the Canadian flag. To cement their victory, they left a bottle of Canadian whiskey at the flagpole, as if to say, "Know us well." The Danes caught wind of this. The minister of Greenland personally flew to the island by helicopter. Danish troops removed the Canadian flag, folded it neatly, and raised their own Danish flag. Nearby on the rocks, they left a bottle of Danish schnapps along with a note, "Welcome to Danish territory." Thus, the War of Whiskey commenced. For decades, the hardy military sailors and border guards of the two nations engaged in this peculiar game. The Canadians arrived, took down the Danish flag, and claimed the schnapps. One hopes they consumed it rather than wasting it. They would then raise their flag, leave behind whiskey, Canadian Club, and a note, "Welcome to Canada." A few months later, the Danes would return, lowering the Canadian flag, drinking or taking the whiskey, raising their flag again, and leaving schnapps behind. This was the perfect conflict. No shots fired, no injuries reported, just a mild hangover for the captors. The world watched this unfold with amusement. Diplomats sent protest notes while the militaries continued their barter. Once, in 2005, Canadian Defense Minister Bill Graham landed on the island for a stroll. Denmark issued an official protest over the occupation. Newspapers reported on the invasion, but everyone understood it to be just another round of alcoholic diplomacy. The internet even proposed its own solutions. Some suggested settling the dispute with a pillow fight, while others proposed leaving the island to the non-existent penguins. But the funniest part of the story is how it concluded. In June 2022, as the world was engulfed in genuine, terrifying conflicts, Denmark and Canada came to a decision. Let's stop drinking. They gathered at the negotiating table and simply divided the island in half, drawing a line straight through the rock. Now, Canada and Denmark share a land border through Greenland, the first in history. The Whiskey War has officially come to an end. This tale is a rare ray of light. It demonstrates that even territorial disputes can be resolved humanely, with humor, respect, and a good drink. If all wars in the world were fought this way, arrive, leave a bottle, and depart, the world would indeed be a much nicer place. However, unfortunately, not all stories conclude with a toast. Sometimes, human ingenuity is plagued not by amusing traditions, but by monsters that make one want to hide under a blanket. Story number 6. Robbery, Canadian style. When we think of the perfect heist, we envision a bank, lasers, masked men, and bags filled with diamonds. However, in Canada, the criminal world operates a little differently. Its main treasure is neither gold nor money. It is a sticky, sweet, amber-colored liquid. Maple syrup. It may sound like a joke, but it's not. Maple syrup is more expensive than oil, much more. In the province of Quebec, there exists a place that sounds fictional, yet it is real, the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve. It's a massive warehouse the size of several football fields. There, liquid gold is stored in white barrels in case of a poor harvest. It's the Ford NX for sweet tooth lovers. In 2011, a group of individuals decided that $18 million was far too significant an amount to just sit in barrels. But how do you stealthily steal 3,000 tons of syrup? They didn't blast through walls or take hostages. Instead, they rented part of the same warehouse under the guise of another company and began to operate quietly, methodically, almost homely. Every night, the thieves would sneak into the storage. They approached the stacks of barrels. Climbing up was dangerous, the barrels could topple. So they only siphoned syrup from the lower rows. They unscrewed the lids, inserted pumps, and transferred the syrup into their tankers. But then, a problem arose. A full barrel weighs nearly 300 kilograms, whereas an empty one weighs just a few dozen. If they left them empty, someone would notice they were too light, or the stack might simply collapse. And this is where the thieves displayed true Canadian ingenuity. They brought water with them. They filled the barrels back up with water so that the weight would match. The operation lasted for months. They worked like ants, transporting syrup and selling it to dealers on the black market. Yes, there is a black market for syrup. They laundered the money. They stole nearly 10,000 barrels. 6 million pounds of syrup vanished. The entire scheme was uncovered by sheer coincidence and, quite foolishly, one day, a reserve inspector conducted a routine check. He decided to climb to the top row of barrels. Usually, that is quite challenging. The barrels are stacked like a mountain. But this time, one of the barrels beneath his feet wobbled. It was empty. The thieves had become lazy at some point and stopped refilling them with water. The inspector tapped on the barrel. The sound was resonant. He opened it. Empty. He opened the next one. Water. Panic ensued. The police cordoned off the area. It turned out that 60% of the stock had simply evaporated. This incident was dubbed the Great Maple Syrup Heist. The police arrested 17 individuals. The gang leader received an 8-year prison sentence along with a $9 million fine. The most humorous aspect of this tale is that syrup cannot be marked like banknotes. It's impossible to trace it by serial number. Most likely, when you were enjoying pancakes at a cafe somewhere in 2012, you doused them with that very stolen syrup without even realizing that you were handling evidence in an $18 million case. By the way, the judge who handed down the sentence remarked that the thieves acted out of insatiable greed. But I believe there was also incredible patience involved. Manually siphoning 3,000 tons of liquid is, hard work. It's a shame they didn't channel that energy into something legal, like waffle making. Now let's shift from sweet to savory and very deep, to where people perform feats not for money, but simply to survive in a tin can at the bottom of the sea. Story number 7. A package with a human soul. Freedom. How much is it worth? For some, millions. For others, a life. For Henry Brown, the price of freedom was equivalent to the cost of a postage stamp and a few wooden boards. Virginia, 1849. Henry was a slave. He worked at a tobacco factory. He had a wife and children, but they were sold to another owner. He watched as they were taken away in chains. At that moment, something broke and simultaneously was born within him. He decided, I am no longer a thing. I am a man, and I will be free or dead. But how to escape? Slaves are watched. Patrols with dogs on every road. If caught, they'd be beaten to death. That's when a crazy claustrophobic idea occurred to Henry. If he was a thing in the eyes of the law, why not send this thing by mail? He found an accomplice, a sympathetic white shopkeeper who loved money. They built a wooden box. The dimensions were comical, 90 centimeters long, 80 high, and 60 wide. Imagine a large box that once housed an old television. An adult man would have to sit in there, knees pulled up to his chin, like an embryo. Henry took a water bag and a drill with him to create air holes. On the lid they wrote in big letters, "Fragile cargo, keep upright, handle with care." Address, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There, slavery did not exist. On March 29th, he climbed inside. They nailed the lid shut. Darkness, tightness, panic. The package was given to the Adams Express Courier Service, and hell began. The loaders, of course, did not read the labels. The box was thrown around, turned upside down. At one point, Henry found himself upside down, and he remained that way for several hours. Blood rushed to his head. His eyes, he realized, were about to burst. The veins in his temples throbbed. He felt like he was dying. He wanted to scream, to ask them to turn the box over, but he understood that one sound meant the end. Death or slavery. He endured. He prayed on the train, in the cart, on the steamboat. He was tossed, shaken, slammed against the walls. The journey lasted 27 hours. 27 hours, curled up in the fetal position, shrouded in total darkness, unaware of your destination and whether you'll arrive alive. At last, Philadelphia, an office for abolitionists, those who fought against slavery. They received notice of a cargo. 4 men gathered around a wooden crate, hesitant to open it. They expected to find a corpse inside. One of them grabbed a hammer, struck it, and the nails creaked. The lid flew off. Slowly, with the creaking of stiff joints, a sweaty, exhausted, yet living man emerged from the box. Henry Brown straightened up, looked at the astonished white men, and, like a true gentleman, said, "How do you do, gentlemen?" Then he sang a psalm of gratitude to God. Henry earned the nickname Box for the crate. He became a symbol of ingenuity and indomitable will for freedom. He toured, sharing his story, and even incorporated the very same box into his performance. Think about this the next time you complain about being cramped in a minibus or an economy class on a plane. This man spent a day in a wooden coffin, hanging upside down, just to be able to say, "I belong to myself." However, sometimes survival requires not hiding in a box but stepping into the light and doing something so audacious that no one can believe their eyes. Like, for instance, a man who sold something that didn't belong to him without even batting an eyelash. Story number 8. The Emperor of Emptiness. You see, there are people who are simply bored with wealth. Yachts, mansions, and champagne are not enough for them. They seek something more. For example, their own country, ideally an empire. Meet Jacques Lebaudet, a Frenchman, heir to a vast sugar fortune. At the beginning of the 20th century, he had so much money that he could purchase half of Paris. But Jacques didn't want Paris. He craved a crown. In 1903, he equips his luxurious yacht, the Frasquita. He assembles a crew of sailors, adventurers, and merely drifters, promising them golden mountains. They sail southward to the shores of Africa. Upon landing on the coast of modern-day Western Sahara, there's nothing around but sand, wind, and the ocean. A desert. The perfect location, Jacques decides. He unsheathes his sword, plunges it into a dune, and proclaims loudly, "These lands belong to me from this day forward. I hereby establish the Empire of the Sahara." Naturally, he declares himself Emperor Jacques I. This was no game. He was utterly serious. He orders his men to construct a capital, naming it Troy. Why not? Tents and some meager structures begin to rise from the sands. Jacques walks around in a uniform adorned with medallions that he invented for himself, issuing decrees. He writes letters to world leaders, the King of England, the President of France, the President of the United States. "Greetings, colleagues. I, Emperor Jacques I, propose we establish diplomatic relations." European newspapers are thrilled. They publish caricatures, laughing and dubbing him the Sugar Emperor, a play on words, sugar business and Sahara. But Jacques believes this is merely envy. Meanwhile, problems start to arise, threefold. It turns out there is no water in the desert. Who would have thought, right? The emperor's subjects, the hired sailors, begin to grumble. They yearn to drink, eat, and return home. Yet Jacques commands them to march and salute. Soon, 5 sailors rush up. They are captured by local Mauritanian nomads and sold into slavery. Emperor Jacques reacts brilliantly. He demands that France declare war on the Mauritanians to rescue his subjects. The French government shakes its head in disbelief and sends a cruiser to retrieve this madman before he sparks an international conflict. Jacques is evacuated. The Sahara Empire lasted merely a few months before vanishing into the sands. But do you think he calmed down? No. Jacques moved to New York City. He settled in the most expensive hotel and continued to insist that he be addressed as Your Majesty. He walked along Broadway in his imperial uniform. One day, he entered stores and attempted to purchase an entire fire engine simply because he liked their helmets. The conclusion of the story is as tragic and absurd as the life of the emperor. In 1919, he was shot by his own wife. Why? Jacques claimed he wanted to export their shared daughter to his non-existent empire to continue the dynasty. His wife decided she had had enough. The jury acquitted her. They concluded that killing a mad emperor who threatened a child was an act of self-defense. Jacques Le Bouty remains in history as a man who had everything but was never satisfied. He bought himself a title, an army, and land, but could not procure the most essential of all, common sense and respect. The sands of the Sahara remember much, but they erase the name of Jacques I quicker than footprints on the beach during a tide. Nevertheless, sometimes madness is quiet, hiding not in the desert, but behind the walls of an ordinary home, where objects are valued more than people. Story number 9. The Ship That Ascended the Mountain. Have you ever pondered what a person driven by greed is capable of? Not merely wanting a new car, but a greed so consuming that it scorches the brain and compels one to argue against the very laws of physics. The closing years of the 19th century. The Amazon was a true green hell. During this time, the world was obsessed with rubber. Wheels, insulation, footwear, all required rubber. Rubber barons lived like gods, building opera houses in the heart of the jungle and sending laundry to Paris just to have it washed. Among them was a man named Carlos Fermín Fitzcarrald. To be honest, he was quite the adventurer, half Peruvian, half American. He sought a path to the untouched rubber forests in the upper reaches of the Madre de Dios River. But there was one problem, a geographical dead end. 2 mighty rivers were separated by a high mountain range, thickly forested. To travel from one river to the other, one would have to navigate thousands of kilometers around. But Fitzcarrald did not want to take the long way. He wanted a direct route. In 1894, he decided to attempt the impossible. He resolved to haul his steamship, the Lady of the Amazon, over this mountain. Imagine 30 tons of steel, a steam boiler, and enormous paddle wheels. This wasn't just a boat, it was a genuine river monster, and it needed to be lifted hundreds of meters through jungle where not a single road existed, only mud and more mud. Do you think he disassembled the ship into parts? Not at all. Fitzcarraldo made the decision to tow it entirely. He gathered hundreds of indigenous people from the Piro tribe, a group of individuals who had never encountered such machines before. He promised them something. In reality, he promised them nothing at all. He merely coerced them into labor. They cleared a path. They felled ancient trees, converting them into logs for towing. Initially, everything went smoothly, but soon the ascent began. Imagine this scene. The sun beat down from above. The humidity was so intense that clothing would rot directly on the skin. Within a few days, millions of insects surrounded them, and there were naked, exhausted individuals pulling enormous winches. The metal cables were tightened to the point that they resonated like guitar strings. If one of those cables snapped, it could sever a person in half, and they did snap. The vessel progressed mere centimeters per hour. During the day it was pulled, but at night it could slide down, destroying everything in its path. People were dying in dozens from malaria, exhaustion, and under the weight of the very steel itself. Why? For what purpose? Just for one man to grow even richer. At one point, the indigenous people revolted. They believed that this iron beast was a curse from the gods. Yet Fitzcarraldo had rifles. an argument that was difficult to contest. And do you know what's most incredible? He actually did it. After several months of torment, the Cantamen truly found itself at the mountain's peak, and then it was lowered on the other side into the waters of Madre de Dios. The steamboat entered the river where no one expected to see it. Fitzcarraldo opened the way to unimaginable wealth. He became extraordinarily rich. He was referred to as the King of Rubber. He proved that the will of man is stronger than nature. But nature is a vengeful lady. She does not forgive such offenses. Just 3 years later, in 1997, Carlos Fitzcarraldo was navigating his other steamboat on the Urubamba River. The vessel crashed into a reef. The very man who made the ship climb the mountain failed to keep it afloat. He drowned. He was only 35 years old. Today, the isthmus over which he dragged the steel bears his name. Rusty metal fragments and remnants of chains are still found there. The jungle has consumed everything else. Story number 10. The bridge that lost its way in the desert. Have you ever bought something truly massive? Not a house or even a yacht, but let's say an entire town. Or, for instance, the legendary stone bridge over the Great River. To be honest, most of us would double-check our change at the store. But Robert McCulloch was a different kind of person. He was the type of American millionaire who acted first and then wondered if he had violated any laws of physics. Picture this: the late 60s, Arizona. A place called Lake Havasu City, although, to be frank, calling it a city was a clear mockery. It was merely a patch of blistering desert, sand, cacti, scorpions, and heat so intense that your brains would start to melt by noon. McCulloch bought land there to construct his dream city. However, there was one issue. People were not interested in purchasing land in the middle of nowhere. They needed something special, some feature that would make them want to abandon everything and relocate to this furnace. And then McCulloch heard the news. In London, yes, that very foggy London, they are selling a bridge. A genuine London bridge from the year 1831. You see, the old stone giant simply couldn't cope anymore. It was literally sinking in the Thames under the weight of modern cars. The city officials decided, let's take it apart and build a new one. But what to do with the old one? Not just throw it away, right? They put it up for auction. And then this crazy bloke, McCulloch, raises his hand. $2,460,000, he declares. A pause. The hammer strikes. Sold to a man from the desert. Do you think he bought it to put it in his garden? Far from it. A process started that would give any logistics expert a heart attack. Workers in London began to dismantle the bridge, brick by brick. 10,000 tons of granite. Each block, each brick was carefully numbered. Number 1, number 2, 3, 854. All to later reassemble this colossal puzzle. Then everything was loaded onto ships, crossing the ocean, through the Panama Canal to a port in California, and from there, transported by trucks across the desert. Just imagine the face of a regular farmer seeing a piece of British history being hauled past his house on a trailer. But the funniest part, do you know what it is? When the bridge arrived in Arizona, there was no water underneath it whatsoever. The bridge stood amidst the sand, like some forgotten artifact of an alien civilization. But McCulloch didn't blink an eye. He declared, if there's no river, we will dig one. And they excavated an entire canal beneath the bridge to turn a piece of desert into an island. They recreated an English village around it, red telephone booths, pubs amidst cacti in temperatures of 45 degrees Celsius in the shade. Rumors circulated that McCulloch was a fool who thought he was buying the Tower Bridge, complete with towers and drawbridge sections. That would have made for a great newspaper story, but in reality, he knew exactly what he was getting. He didn't need a symbol. He needed wilderness, and he got it. In October 1971, the bridge was ceremoniously opened. The Lord Mayor of London flew out to Arizona, sweating in his heavy velvet attire, probably wondering where he had landed. And you know what? The plan worked. McCulloch's madness paid off. People came to see the bridge that had wandered into the sands. The town thrived. Today, it is a popular tourist destination, and the bridge is still there. It stands firmly gripping the Arizona soil, seemingly shocked at how far it strayed from the Thames. This is a tale about how, if you have a goal and enough audacity, even an old bridge can make a round-the-world journey. The key is to properly number the bricks. However, sometimes people unearth not just old stones, but items that can change our understanding of what it means to be human. And occasionally these discoveries leave us speechless in horror or awe. Story number 11. A Race with Death in an Icy Hell. Listen, have you ever truly felt cold? Not that chill that just makes you want to grab a warmer sweater, but the kind that digs into your lungs, where every breath burns inside like you're swallowing broken glass. Picture a place cut off from the world by 1,000 kilometers of ice and darkness, and imagine that children there begin to die. January 1925. Alaska, the small town of Nome. That winter was, frankly, brutal, even by local standards. The town is squeezed between the frozen sea and vast tundra. Navigation is shut down. Forget about airplanes. The tiny crop dusters that were left in Alaska simply wouldn't have started, and even if they did, a storm would tear them to shreds. It is in this icy trap that diphtheria begins to spread, a terrifying disease that suffocates children. The town's only doctor, Dr. Curtis Welch, had run out of serum last summer. He sends out a radio message. "We need help. Urgently." The nearest fresh batch of medicine is over 1,000 kilometers away in Anchorage. The train can only reach Neenah Station. There are no more railroads beyond that, only snow, wolves, and wind. The authorities decide to organize a relay of dog sled teams. 20 mushers and 150 dogs. They must transport a case of serum across all of Alaska. Normally, this journey takes 25 days, but the children in Nome don't have 25 days. They have a maximum of 6. And so, on January 27th, the first musher takes the precious package. 52 degrees below zero. Darkness. You can't see your own hands on the sled's handlebars. Picture Leonard Seppala. He was a legendary figure. His team was led by a dog named Togo. You know, everyone remembers Balto, but the true hero of that race was Togo. Seppala had to tackle the most perilous part of the journey. To shorten the path, he decided to go directly across the ice of Norton Sound. It was pure suicide. The ice cracked and shifted under the dog's paws. A blizzard raged around them. Visibility was 0. At any moment, the ice floe could break away and drift into the open ocean. But Togo led them onward. He could sense the edge of the ice in complete darkness. At one point, their ice floe truly did break away. They drifted in the icy slurry for several hours until they were grounded on land. Seppala grabbed Togo, jumped onto solid ground, and pulled the entire team along. They traveled 146 kilometers without rest across ice that was crumbling underfoot. And then there was the final leg. Gunnar Kaasen and his dog Balto. The storm intensified to the point that Kaasen couldn't see the dogs that were a mere meter away. The wind flipped the sleds. At one moment, the crate of serum flew into a snowbank. In panic, Kaasen frantically dug through the snow with his bare hands, freezing his fingers until he felt the coveted package. On February 2nd, at 5:30 in the morning, the exhausted team rolled into Nome. They completed the journey in 5.5 days. 5.5 days instead of 20. The medicine had arrived, the children were saved. Kaasen was so drained that he could barely speak. He simply collapsed next to Balto and began cleaning the ice from his dog's paws. Listen, this was a victory not of machines or engines, but of sheer wild will and loyalty. When Balto became famous, when a statue was erected in New York City, Leonard Seppala felt a bit slighted for his Togo. And I understand him. Togo endured the worst of it. He went blind after that expedition and never raced again, but he saved the town. This is a story of how, when civilization falters, when engines die and technology turns into a heap of metal, ancient instincts come to the forefront. And sometimes, an old dog in a blizzard is all that stands between us and oblivion. But, sometimes even the most heroic victory over nature pales in comparison to what humans can inflict upon one another, often getting entangled in their own fantasies, or in one very peculiar message that seems to come from nowhere. This is story number 12. A magician who subdued an entire army with just one box. Do you believe in magic? No, not the kind with rabbits in hats and shuffled cards, but that which has the power to halt a war. To be honest, when we think of diplomacy, we envision people in suits engaged in tedious negotiations. However, in 1856, the government of France decided that instead of diplomats, they needed a magician. Picture this: Algeria. Heat. Dust. The French colony hangs by a thread. Local tribes, incited by their spiritual leaders, the Marabout, are preparing for a great rebellion. The Marabout perform miracles, consume glass, walk on embers, and convince the warriors that their magic is stronger than French bullets. Gunpowder and steel are powerless against faith. And then enters Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. To clarify, this is the man known as the father of modern magic. Now retired, he lives in his estate near Paris, tinkering with mechanisms, but the government implores him, "Go to Algeria, show them that our magic is real." Robert Houdin agrees. He arrives in Algeria not with cannons, but with a couple of wooden boxes and a knowledge of physics that no one in the desert could fathom. The main event takes place in a vast tent filled with tribal leaders. Stern men in turbans with daggers at their waists are present. They look at this thin Parisian in a black tailcoat with utter disdain. What can he possibly show us? Robert Houdin steps into the center of the circle. In his hands, he holds a tiny wooden box with a metal handle, a mere trifle. He places it on the ground. "And now," he says through a translator, "I will take the strength from the bravest among you." A gigantic warrior steps forward, muscular and confident. He effortlessly lifts the box over his head. The marabouts laugh. What's the trick? But Robert Houdin makes a gesture with his hands. His expression turns serious. "Now you are weak as a child. Try again." The warrior bends down, grips the handle, and nothing happens. The box remains still. The man strains, his neck veins bulging. He literally turns crimson with effort, but the box seems anchored to the ground. He tries to lift it with both hands, bracing his feet against the floor. Useless. The small box, weighing only a couple of kilograms, feels heavier than a mountain. Silence fills the tent. An oppressive atmosphere, thick with the scent of camel hair and fear, envelops the crowd. The warrior recoils, gasping for air. He is humiliated. He, the conqueror of lions, cannot lift a lady's trinket box. Robert Houdin smiles. He gestures again, and the box becomes light once more. A small child lifts it effortlessly. Do you know what the secret was? Science. The floor was equipped with a powerful electromagnet, a new invention of its time. The bottom of the box was made of iron. When the assistant backstage sent an electric current through it, not even a dozen horses could have lifted that box off the ground. But that was not the end. Robert Houdin decided to further undermine their authority. He challenged the Marabout to shoot him with a real battle rifle. The chief fired a shot. Robert Houdin caught the bullet with his teeth. In reality, he had merely swapped out the bullet for a wax one that crumbled in the barrel, while hiding a real bullet in his mouth beforehand. But for the people in the tent, this was the end. They concluded that if the French could command the weight of objects and catch bullets with their teeth, fighting against them was sheer madness. The uprising was thwarted without a single shot being fired. One magician in a worn tailcoat achieved more than an entire army. Rob Houdin returned to France, received the Order of the Legion of Honor, and retired once more. He demonstrated that knowledge is not just power, but true magic. Listen, that really makes you think. We often trust our eyes, not realizing that behind the scenes, someone is merely pressing a button. However, sometimes what unfolds right before our eyes cannot be explained by any science, especially when it concerns a person who dared to challenge death itself, trapped in a situation with no escape. Story number 13. A rebellion born from straw. Have you ever pondered how fragile our civilization is? We construct skyscrapers, enact laws, engage in important negotiations, yet sometimes it takes just a small, insignificant detail for a crowd to turn into an uncontrollable mob. And honestly, in this story, that detail was an ordinary straw hat. New York, 1922, September. Back then, fashion was more than just a suggestion. It was a sacred scripture. Men in New York had an unspoken rule. Straw hats could only be worn until September 15th. That was it. If you stepped out in a straw hat after the 16th, you were officially considered a public nuisance and a target for ridicule. It was called the Day of the Felt Hat. Everyone was expected to switch to a heavier felt. This usually ended with teenagers knocking hats off passers-by and trampling them. A silly, foolish tradition, but that year, something went awry. 13th of September. Yes, they hadn't even reached that fateful 15th yet. A group of young men in the Mulberry Bend area decided that waiting for the official date was far too boring. They began snatching hats from the workers returning home through the docks. But these workers weren't office clerks. They were tough men, accustomed to hitting back when struck. A brawl broke out, a small scuffle, of which there were hundreds. The next day, true chaos ensued. Imagine New York streets filled with gangs of young people. There were hundreds, and then thousands. They armed themselves with sticks, with nails driven into the end. Why? To snag hats straight from the heads of passers-by. But merely knocking off hats was not enough for them. They craved blood. They attacked men in alleyways. They stormed onto streetcars, yanking passengers out onto the street. If you were wearing a straw hat, you were an enemy. Thousands of youths marched along Broadway shouting threats. This was no joke. It was urban warfare. The police were in shock. They tried to disperse the crowd, but the rioters simply darted over to the next street. At one point, a gang of 1,000 individuals seized a bridge, halting every vehicle and inspecting the heads of the drivers. Those who refused to remove their hats were beaten into unconsciousness. Dozens of people ended up in hospitals with fractures and severe injuries. The fighting continued for 8 days. 8 long days, and the city was in turmoil due to bits of woven straw. Do you know what is most absurd? Some newspapers from that time almost justified the rioters. They wrote that men should adhere to standards of decency. Yet, hold on, beating people with clubs armed with nails? This, in their view, is considered decency. The unrest only subsided when torrential rains began, making it simply too cold to wear straw. The police finally conducted mass arrests. Many teenagers were incarcerated, and the courts were overwhelmed with property damage lawsuits. This story serves as a vivid reminder of how easily fashion rules can turn into a justification for violence. We laugh about it today, but during that week in New York, no one found it amusing. One small tradition almost set the city ablaze. Interestingly, after that year, the hat-stripping tradition began to gradually fade. People realized that life was more valuable than their neighbor's opinion about their headwear. Well, even now, when we notice something inappropriate in a passerby's clothing, sometimes that little savage from 22 resurfaces within us. The key is not to give it a stick, and sometimes what appears to be mass insanity is, in fact, the result of cold mathematical calculations, or a grand blunder that had been concealed for decades. Story number 14. A war that ended faster than your lunch. You know, we tend to think of war as something endless. Years in the trenches, decades of conflicts, generations raised under the roar of cannons. But there was a case in history when everything, from the first shot to total surrender, took less time than the duration of your favorite sitcom or while you wait for your pizza delivery. Imagine, August 27th, 1896, Zanzibar. A sweltering morning filled with the scents of cloves and the sea. A heavy, tense atmosphere hung over the palace of Sultan Khalid ibn Bargash. The Sultan had just seized power after the death of his predecessor, but the British Empire had other plans. They wanted to see their man on the throne. The ultimatum was simple and harsh. Surrender by 9 o'clock in the morning or we will open fire. Khalid, to be honest, was not the cowardly type, or perhaps he was merely overly confident. He barricaded himself in the palace with 3,000 soldiers. He rolled antiquated cannons onto the shore. He even armed his only yacht, Glengarry, which was gently bobbing in the harbor. He thought the British were bluffing, but they never bluff. At 9 o'clock, 5 British warships loomed in the harbor. On deck, sailors stood frozen at their guns. The silence was so profound that the cries of seagulls could be heard. The captain on the flagship glanced at his watch. 9:01. The signal was given, and hell broke loose. The first salvo of explosive shells transformed the Sultan's palace, that ornate wooden structure, into a pile of splinters and dust. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. British cannons fired with such precision that each shell found its target. The palace was engulfed in flames. The Sultan's soldiers were fleeing in panic. And what about the Glasgow, the pride of the Zanzibar fleet? It attempted to shoot at the British cruiser. It was quaint. In response, the British simply fired a single volley. The yacht began to sink almost immediately. The most surreal aspect of this scene was that the British flag was still flying on the sinking ship, which the Sultan had forgotten to lower because the yacht was a gift from Queen Victoria. Khalid ibn Bargash, witnessing the disintegration of his empire, decided not to wait for the end. He dashed out of the palace through a back entrance and raced to the German consulate. You see, he ran so swiftly that his soldiers did not immediately realize they were now fighting alone. By 9:40, it was all over. In 38 minutes. Just 38 minutes of furious fire. 500 people from Zanzibar had been killed or wounded. The British suffered one lightly wounded sailor. The Sultan's flag was shot down. The gunfire ceased, and smoke began to slowly settle over the ruins. This was the shortest official war in the history of mankind. Do you know what's most ironic? The British later sent a bill to the new Sultan for the ammunition they used to destroy the palace. They claimed, "We worked here because of you. Kindly cover the expenses." This story serves as a harsh lesson about what happens when the ambitions of a tiny nation collide with the cold logic of a great empire. Sometimes it's better to take off your watch and walk away than to attempt to argue with naval cannons. 38 minutes of disgrace, and the world will forever remember your name. But if technology and caliber determine the outcome here, in the next tale, everything will hinge on one single person. A man who found himself trapped in time and space. Someone sought in places where the living rarely tread. Story number 15. A fleet with a taste of caramel. You know, the Cold War was not just about espionage, nuclear missiles, and stern-faced generals. Sometimes it was about soda. Yes, just an ordinary fizzy drink that we've gotten used to buying from any kiosk. But by the late 80s, this drink transformed an ordinary American corporation into a formidable maritime power. Honestly, if you had told the admirals of the early century about this, they would have thought you'd had too much schnapps. Imagine, it's 1989, in the Soviet Union. Perestroika is in full swing. People in Moscow are queuing for everything, from bread to jeans. Yet there is one thing they love above all: Pepsi Cola. Soviet citizens consumed billions of bottles of this black, sweet water. But there was one tiny problem, as huge as an iceberg. The USSR had no currency, no real hard dollars to pay for the syrup. The Soviet ruble was worth about as much abroad as the wrapper of a candy. It could not be exchanged on the world market. So the sides had to get creative. Initially, Pepsi was traded for Stolichnaya vodka. Barter, pure classic. But by the end of the 80s, Americans could no longer sell as much vodka in the US as the Russians were consuming soda. A new product was needed, something substantial, something very metallic. And so, in May 1989, the world was shaken. The Soviet government and PepsiCo entered into an agreement. It sounds like the ramblings of a madman, doesn't it? In exchange for soda concentrate, the USSR handed over an entire fleet to the corporation. 17 submarines, a destroyer, a frigate, a cruiser, and even several massive oil tankers. For one brief, surreal moment, the company known for making bubbles became the owner of the 6th largest military fleet in the world. Imagine the Pepsi board in New York City, seated in their plush chairs, sipping soda while metaphorically, under their windows, 17 diesel submarines rocked on the waves. Absurd, isn't it? Company President Donald Kendall even joked in a conversation with a U.S. National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." Frankly, he was not exaggerating by much. Of course, Pepsi had no intention of invading neighboring countries or patrolling the oceans. They had no use for torpedo tubes or radars. What they needed was scrap metal. This entire fleet, rusty and aging but still imposing, was sold for scrap to Sweden and Norway. The corporation was simply looking to recoup its expenses. But the very idea of it, a private company selling sugary water suddenly holding the power to wipe a small nation off the map, is telling of that era. The world was changing so rapidly that logic was struggling to keep up. Fearsome weapons that had threatened the globe for decades suddenly became currency for purchasing fizz. It was a triumph of sugar over gunpowder, the most peaceful and peculiar arms transfer in history. But while at one end of the world submarines were traded for syrup, at the other end, people were doing something that could not be measured in money or metal. They defied fate where chances of survival seemed non-existent, and sometimes all that saved them was a miracle, or one very small but crucial detail that everyone overlooked. Story number 16. The advertisement that exploded in Texas. Tell me, have you ever thought about what people are willing to do for a good show? Honestly, we complain today about intrusive online ads, but imagine a time when, to promote a railroad, marketers came up with the outrageous idea of simply destroying two massive trains in front of a huge crowd. Year, 1927, Texas. William Crush, an agent for the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, scratches his head. He needs to boost ticket sales and concocts a plan that sounds downright crazy. Let's stage a head-on collision of two trains, he suggests to the higher-ups. Astonishingly, they agree. They choose a site 30 kilometers from the town of Waco. Over a few days, a whole town sprang up in the middle of nowhere. They even named it Crush. It featured water, restaurants, attractions, and even a temporary jail. A ticket for this spectacle cost just $2. September 15th. The heat is so intense that the air quivers. In the plains, 40,000 people have gathered. 40. 0 is a larger number than the population of most Texas cities at that time. Families arrived together, including children in picnic baskets. They anticipated a spectacle. At each end of the specially laid track stood two colossal trains. The steam locomotive number 629, painted a vivid red, and number 642, a deep green. Magnificent, powerful machines. William Crash rode onto the track on a white horse. He waved his hat. This was the signal. The engineers opened the valves and leaped down. The trains began to slowly pick up speed, faster, even faster. 40,000 people held their breath. The roar of steam and the rumble of the ground. The two trains hurtled toward each other, each traveling at 70 kilometers per hour. The total force of the collision was beyond the comprehension of 19th century minds. And then came the moment of silence, followed by a deafening crash of steel. But what Crash had not foreseen happened. The engineers had sworn to him that the boilers would not explode. They were mistaken. At the moment of impact, both boilers detonated simultaneously. Imagine two gigantic shrapnel bombs. Thousands of pieces of searing iron soared into the sky. They flew like bullets. Chaos erupted in the crowd. People ran, but there was nowhere to hide from the metal raining down. A massive bolt struck a photographer right in the eye. Fragments of the hull cut through people like grass. This was no show. It was a slaughter. When the smoke cleared, all that remained at the site of the collision was a heap of mangled, smoking metal and blood on the dusty grass. At least 3 lives were lost, and hundreds suffered injuries. William McCrash was dismissed that very evening. But do you know what's the wildest part of this story? He was rehired the very next morning. Do you know why? Because this incident made headlines in newspapers around the world. The railroad received an amount of publicity they could only dream of. People continued to buy tickets, just to pass by the site where the trains had exploded. Human curiosity is a frightening thing. We are willing to pay for risk, for blood, for others' madness. Crash understood this. He turned tragedy into legend. And frankly, looking at modern blockbusters, it's clear that we haven't changed much since then. We still crave something that goes boom. But sometimes, to witness something truly grand and terrifying, there's no need for explosions. It's enough just to glance at a world map. There, among the oceans, lie mysteries that have baffled people for centuries. One of these is connected to an island that intermittently appears and disappears, driving cartographers mad. Story number 17. The day the sky fell into the harbor. Have you ever considered how thin the line is between an ordinary winter morning and the complete end of the world? We plan our day, sip coffee, and argue over trivial matters. Meanwhile, two ships in a narrow channel are unable to agree on who should yield, and within 5 minutes, the city ceases to exist. On the 6th of December 1917, Canada, in the city of Halifax, World War I was underway. At that time, Halifax resembled a massive anthill. Ships carrying troops, coal, food, and weapons were constantly shuttling back and forth, preparing for a leap across the Atlantic. A Norwegian vessel named Mont Blanc is entering the harbor in a hurry. Coming towards it is a French truck, the Emo. To be honest, at that moment, the Mont Blanc was the most dangerous object in the world. It was stuffed to the brim. 2,300 tons of picric acid, 500 tons of TNT, and dozens of barrels of benzene stacked right on the deck. It was not just a ship, it was a colossal bomb that someone had decided to sail. In the narrow strait, the captains got confused by the signals. One horn, two horns, and a misunderstanding ensued. The Emo collided with the starboard side of the Mont Blanc. It wasn't a hard hit, just a small dent, but that was enough. The barrels of benzene on the Mont Blanc's deck burst open, and the liquid flowed into the hold where the explosives were stored. A shower of sparks from the impact ignited a fire. The crew of the Mont Blanc, aware of what was beneath them, didn't play the heroes. They leaped into the lifeboats and rowed toward shore as if they were being chased by all the demons of hell. They shouted, "Run! It's going to blow!" But they shouted in French. In English-speaking Halifax, no one understood them. A strange, frightening silence fell. The burning ship drifted towards the shore until it crashed into the pier. The city's inhabitants, imagine it was morning, saw a bright fire in the port and a pillar of black smoke. What does a person do? Correct, they go to take a look. People flooded onto the waterfront. Hundreds of workers abandoned their tasks. School children pressed their noses against the windows. It was just so fascinating. A big fire. No one knew what lay within the Mont Blanc. To them, it was merely a burning steamship. At 9:44 in the morning, the most powerful man-made explosion occurred before the invention of the atomic bomb. In an instant, the Mont Blanc ceased to exist as a solid body. It transformed into superheated gas. The temperature at the epicenter soared to 5,000 degrees. The shockwave traveled at over 1,000 meters per second, literally sweeping away all buildings within a 2-kilometer radius. Trees were uprooted and shattered into dust. But the most terrifying scene unfolded inside the homes. Those very people who had been looking out of their windows. The blast wave turned glass windows into billions of tiny daggers. Thousands of people were blinded in an instant, and then the water arrived. The explosion displaced the water from the harbor, exposing the seabed. Then it returned as an 18-meter tsunami, sweeping away everything that had survived the flames. You know what best illustrates the magnitude of this madness? The anchor of the Mont Blanc, weighing half a ton, was found 4 kilometers from the harbor. It was simply thrown over forests and hills, while a cannon from the deck was launched 5.5 kilometers in the opposite direction. A massive piece of steel framing crashed onto the roof of a house in a nearby settlement, penetrating it completely. The city was transformed into a smoldering wasteland. Nearly 2,000 lost their lives instantly, and 9,000 were injured. The following morning, a fierce blizzard, the most powerful in decades, struck the ruins of Halifax. Survivors died from the cold beneath the rubble of their homes. Yet even in this dark hour, there were heroes. Railway dispatcher Vince Coleman remained at his post. He knew a passenger train carrying 300 people was heading towards the city. He managed to send a telegram. "Stop the train. A munition ship is on fire. It's coming to the pier. Goodbye." He perished on the spot, but the train halted outside the death zone. This is a tale about how a minor navigational mistake can lead to a catastrophe of planetary proportions. We construct fragile barriers, Yet sometimes reality itself tears apart at the seams. By the way, after this tragedy, the regulations for transporting hazardous materials in ports changed permanently. However, the memory of that day still lingers in Halifax. Every year, at 9 o'clock in the morning, bells ring to commemorate the day when the harbor was sent skyward. Sometimes, what was meant to annihilate us unexpectedly becomes the inception of something entirely different, something that challenges the very logic of human existence. Story number 18. The Geniuses from Cell Number 2. Have you ever pondered what lies beneath the surface of ordinary objects? For instance, take a dictionary. We consult it when we are unsure how to spell the word precedent, or what differentiation means. With its dry pages, formal typeface, and academic precision, it feels as though it was crafted by dull individuals in dusty libraries. Yet, to be honest, one of the most significant dictionaries in human history, the Oxford English Dictionary, was partly compiled by a man who at the time was confined in a cell for insane murderers. This is not a metaphor. It was the late 19th century in England. Professor James Murray undertook an impossible task: to compile every word in the English language, along with examples of their usage over the past several centuries. This was an immense endeavor. Murray issued a call for help, asking people to send in cards with citations from books. Suddenly, his mailbox began to fill with letters. These were perfect letters, with calligraphic handwriting, profound knowledge of literature, and thousands of cards referencing the rarest editions from the 15th and 16th centuries. The sender's name was Dr. William Chester Minor. The address? Crowthorne, Berkshire. For 20 years, imagine, this man sent tens of thousands of quotes. Murray was thrilled. He regarded Minor as a great scholarly recluse who was simply too humble to come to Oxford for a formal dinner. The professor wrote to him, "Come visit us. We want to shake your hand." But Minor always politely, yet firmly, declined. Finally, in 1896, Murray could no longer bear it. He boarded a train and traveled to Crowthorne himself, eager to meet this genius. He arrived at a vast, grim brick building with towering walls. A director greeted him. Murray bowed and stated, "I've come to see Dr. Minor. I hope he's home." The director looked at him with a strange mix of sympathy and astonishment. "Professor, it seems you do not fully understand. Dr. Minor is indeed here, but this is Broadmoor, a psychiatric hospital for criminals, and William Minor is our most dangerous patient." Murray was devastated. It turned out that William Minor had been an American military surgeon, an exceptional doctor who had endured the horrors of the Civil War in the United States. There, he lost his sanity, convinced that Irish spies crept under his bed at night to torment him. He fled to England, hoping to escape his phantoms, only to find that the ghost had followed him. In a frigid February night in 1872, Minor leaped from his bed, grabbed a revolver, and dashed outside. He felt like someone had just left his room. He caught sight of an ordinary passerby, a simple worker named George Merritt, who was heading to his shift. Minor shot him in the back, killing him instantly. The court deemed him insane. He was locked away in Broadmoor for life, and there, in a cell overflowing with books from floor to ceiling, this man found his salvation. He resolved that, if he could not manage his demons, he would control the words. He read voraciously, jotting down every rare phrase, every forgotten meaning. Working on the dictionary became his only link to reality, the sole means of atoning for the life he had taken. The most astounding part? Murray did not turn away his assistants. They became friends. The professor regularly visited the murderer in his cell, and they debated for hours about the origins of words while the guards rattled their keys outside the door. William Minor gifted us hundreds of pages of our language's history while being trapped in his own nightmares. The next time you open a dictionary, remember him. A man who pieced the world back together from his cell number 2. Sometimes, light emerges from profound darkness, and sometimes, darkness is so dense that entire expeditions vanish within it, leaving only questions that remain unanswered and ice that never melts. Story number 19. 99 Days on the Brink of Madness. Let me ask you, have you ever felt exhilaration? Not the kind you get from placing a penny on a lottery ticket, but the kind that makes your teeth clench and your heart race somewhere near your throat. when immense money, reputation, and frankly, your life are on the line. Imagine a world without engines, satellites, or radio. Just wood, sails, and the endless ocean. And two captains who decided that a 99-day race was the best way to prove who was in charge. May 1860, China, Port Fuzhou. The air is thick with the scent of tea, so strong it feels like you could cut it with a knife. A fresh harvest. For London, this is not merely breakfast brew. It is gold. Those who bring back the first tea of the new season will hit the jackpot, a reward for every ton. Fame follows the honor. Clipper ships are anchored in the bay, the most beautiful and swift vessels ever crafted by man. Sleek, long, with masts that tower as high as a 20-story building. Ariel and Taiping are the two others, wooden racers of the ocean. On May 30th, they finished loading almost simultaneously. Just hours apart, they weighed anchor and set out to sea. The great tea race had begun. Picture that journey, 16,000 miles, that's 25,000 kilometers across 3 oceans, around Africa, through storms, calms, and mists, 99 days. And throughout, listen closely, they hardly ever lost sight of each other. Captain Killy on the Ariel and Captain McKinnon on the Taiping were cut from a different cloth. They went days without sleep. They had the crew put up extra sails, even where the masts were already creaking under the wind. The risk was enormous. One wrong turn of the helm, one too powerful wave, and the clipper would go down with all hands and its precious cargo of tea. But they did not slow down. They crossed the equator. With good hope, they navigated the Atlantic. And here it was, on the 6th of September, the English Channel, the Strait of Dover. Imagine the expressions on the lookouts on the shore. Morning. The fog was gradually lifting, and from this white shroud, 2 ships, their massive sails unfurled, emerged, side by side, bow to bow. After 3 months of journeying, after thousands of kilometers, they were so close that the sailors could shout to each other. It was madness. It was impossible. They were racing up the Thames. The wind whistled through the rigging. The decks were awash with water. Ariel surged ahead by a few cables, but Taiping was not giving in. The captains were pushing their vessels to the limit, and even a bit more. They needed to take on a pilot, a person who would guide the ship through the complicated river docking at London. Ariel was the first to signal, but the pilot's boat was closer to Taiping, and here fortune smiled on McKinnon. The pilot boarded Taiping a few minutes earlier. They sped up the river. Londoners abandoned their work and rushed to the embankments. The city had never witnessed such a spectacle. 2 giant clouds of white sailcloth raced down the narrow river, almost brushing against each other's hulls. At 9:45 in the evening, Taiping touched the dock. Just 20 minutes later, only 20 minutes later, Ariel arrived at the adjacent pier. A mere 20 minutes of difference after 99 days of travel. Wait, think about these numbers. This is practically a statistical error. It's a miracle. Do you know how it all ended? The cargo owners were so stunned by this skill that they decided to split the prize evenly. No one wanted to offend the loser because in this race, there were no losers. There were 2 great captains and 2 perfect ships. It marked the sunset of the sail era. In just a few years, the Suez Canal would open, bringing in steamships. They would be dull, smoke-filled, but reliable. The romance would fade, and the clippers would become history. However, that race of 1866 forever remained in the memories of sailors as the pinnacle of human determination. By the way, Ariel later vanished in the ocean, setting out on a voyage and not returning. Perhaps it is still trying to outpace the wind somewhere beyond the horizon. But while here, people struggled against the elements for tea and glory. In the next tale, a man grappled with nature itself to save what could not be bought for any amount of money. And his weapon was not a sail, but silence, and one very peculiar decision. Story number 20. A city that buried itself alive. On June 6th in the year, Seattle. Back then, it was not a hub of technology, but a collection of wooden structures smelling of fish and sawdust. The heat was unbearable. In a tiny furniture workshop, a certain John Beck decided to heat up some glue. Just a pot of glue. He got distracted, and the glue flared up. John poured water on it, only making things worse. The hot liquid spread over the sawdust, and within an hour, Seattle turned into one giant bonfire. 31 blocks burned to the ground, an enormous wasteland on the shore of the bay. It seemed like a tragedy, but the people of Seattle were tough. They looked at the ashes and said, "Perfect, now we can finally do it right." You see, the old Seattle had one dreadful issue: mud. The city was situated in a low-lying area, and during high tides, water from the bay would flood the streets, turning them into a foul swamp. Horses would drown in this sludge right at the main intersections. That's when the city engineers made a bizarre decision. They opted to raise the entire city by 3, 5, and in some places even by 10 meters. But how to accomplish this? You can't simply lift buildings with jacks like they do in Chicago. That would be far too expensive. So they constructed stone walls along the streets, filled the gaps with dirt, and laid new roads at the height of second floors. Now this is where the true surrealism began. Imagine Seattle in the 1890s. You walk along a new sidewalk that is situated at the level of the third floor of an old building. To your right is the entrance to a new store, and to your left is an abyss, a deep chasm, at the bottom of which old life still continues. To reach the barbershop left below, you would have to descend a long, rickety wooden staircase. It was perilous. People, especially tipsy sailors, continuously fell off these makeshift sidewalks into the darkness. 17 individuals met their demise simply trying to cross the road. Yet, the city kept growing. Over time, the building owners realized it was rather inconvenient. They started moving entrances to the new upper floors and simply covered the old first floors with glass panels and concrete slabs. The city administration proclaimed, "That's it, now this is a basement, forget it." And Seattle forgot for a full 30 years. The underground city evolved into a dark labyrinth. It became a haven for vice and a hub for illegal bars. During Prohibition, rivers of whiskey flowed there while respectable citizens attended church above. There lived those who had no place in the light. But in 1907, a plague outbreak occurred. Authorities feared that rats from the underground would devastate the city. They sealed off all entrances, installed grates, placed seals, and an entire layer of the city's history became trapped in darkness. Imagine descending there today. Dust as thick as a finger. Old bank vaults that no one managed to carry away. Pharmacy windows displaying bottles with long-dried medicines. Concert advertisements from 100 years ago. All this beneath the bustle of the modern city. You can hear tires of cars rustling overhead and the sound of pedestrians' heels tapping. You find yourself in a ghostly world that Seattle simply chose to step over. It is both frightening and awe-inspiring at the same time. We walk upon the bones of old cities, unaware of how close the past is to us. Sometimes, it lies just 30 centimeters beneath the concrete under your feet. Yet, while Seattle buried its problems, in the next story, a man believed he could deceive not only space, but the very logic of human perception. Out of love, he created something that made the entire world shudder, and it wasn't a fairy tale. Story number 21. Tracks that a human could not leave behind. Tell me, do you believe that fear has a smell or a sound? To be honest, in our current era, where everyone carries a high-resolution camera in their pocket, we've grown accustomed to finding explanations for any wonder. Reflections of light, glare, photo editing. But imagine a time when the only source of light at night was an oil lamp, with nothing outside but a dense forest and a biting wind. In that darkness, there were moments when events unfolded that compelled entire counties to lock their doors and pray until dawn. On the 8th of February, 1855, in England's Devon County, the night was astonishingly harsh. Heavy thick snow was falling, blanketing the hills and rooftops in white. Residents of the small villages along the coast were soundly sleeping in their beds, cozied up by the warmth of their fires. It seemed like an ordinary winter night, marked by silence. However, when morning arrived, it was as if the familiar world had shattered into pieces. Early passers-by began to notice strange marks on the fresh snow. They were tracks, but not human or canine. Picture a distinct hoofprint, a cloven hoof approximately 10 centimeters long and wide. Yet, the most eerie aspect was not the shape itself, but rather how these prints were arranged. They formed a clear line, one after the other, as if the creature that made them walked on two legs, placing one foot directly in front of the other. Each step was precisely spaced 20 centimeters apart throughout the county. People started to venture outside their homes, following the trail, their faces growing pale. This was no casual stroll through the woods. It was some kind of otherworldly nightmare. The tracks traversed locked gardens and ascended vertical walls standing at 4 meters high. They traversed the roofs of houses, defying gravity as if it were merely a joke. The trail reached a high wall, paused, and then reappeared exactly at the same spot on the other side, at the top. There were no signs of a jump, no snow had fallen, just a continuous trail of hooves making their way along the ridge of the roof. In one instance, the tracks led to a narrow pipe with a diameter of merely 15 centimeters. They approached it from one side and emerged from the other without disturbing a single straw. The creature seemed to have slipped through solid metal. In another place, the tracks entered a closed haystack and exited without disturbing a single strand of hay. Panic engulfed Devon within hours. The distance these tracks covered was astounding, over 160 kilometers all in one night, spanning both sides of the River Exe through 5 or 6 different settlements. People whispered, "It's the devil. He has crossed our lands to count the sinners." Men grabbed pitchforks and guns, heading out to hunt. But whom did they intend to track? The air? An emptiness? Newspapers of the time, including the reputable Times, were filled with such accounts. Scientists attempted to theorize. "It must be badgers," said some. But badgers don't walk on two legs across rooftops for 160 kilometers overnight. It's woodland mice, claimed others. But mice do not leave hoofprints measuring 10 centimeters. Maybe it was a kangaroo that escaped from a private zoo? This was the most popular theory. But kangaroos don't pass through walls and don't leave cloven hooves. More than 150 years have passed. We still do not know what it was. You know what's the strangest part? Similar occurrences have happened before. In 1909 in New Jersey, in the 50s in Scotland, and even quite recently, in 2009, in the very same Denny, a woman discovered identical tracks in her garden after a nighttime snowfall. The same hoofprints, the same perfect straight line. What could it be? A mass hallucination? A rare atmospheric anomaly where water droplets freeze into bizarre shapes? Or, is someone truly walking across our rooftops while we close our eyes? Frankly, sometimes it's better not to know the answer. This tale leaves a lingering sense of vulnerability. We think of our home as our fortress, but for the one who left these tracks, that is not the case. However, sometimes dangers do not emerge from mystical darkness, but from the very heart of human society, from people who seem ordinary, yet harbor secrets potent enough to obliterate all living things for hundreds of miles around. And the most terrifying part? They do it with a smile on their faces. Story number 22. Bombs arriving from silence. Listen, have you ever considered that the greatest threat is not what loudly announces itself with explosions and sirens? True fear is silent. It comes from unexpected sources, completely out of nowhere. Honestly, we have grown accustomed to thinking of war as tanks, airplanes, or, at the very least, spies in trench coats. But imagine a scenario. You are walking through a forest, the sun is shining, birds are singing, and suddenly you stumble upon an ordinary balloon, beautiful, paper-made, peacefully resting in the bushes. And in an instant, the world shatters into pieces. May 1945, Oregon, the countryside, the United States. World War II rages on somewhere across the oceans. People here are living their usual peaceful lives. Pastor Arch Mitchell decides to throw a small celebration for his pregnant wife Elsie and their 5 children from Sunday school. A picnic in nature. What could be safer? They drive into the mountains and find a cozy clearing. Elsie and the kids leap out of the car and dash towards the trees while Arch parks the vehicle. And then the children scream, "Dad, look! There's a giant balloon!" Arch doesn't even get the chance to open his mouth. A blast reverberates, a single, brief, and horrifying explosion. When the smoke cleared, Arch found his family on the grass. 5 children and his wife were killed instantly. They became the only casualties of the war on the North American mainland. And it was not a soldier that killed them. It was paper and wind that did the deed. But wait, how did bombs end up in the forests of Oregon? This was one of the most bizarre and secretive projects of the Japanese military, the Fugo Project. In 1944, Japanese engineers devised a brilliant yet horrifying scheme. They realized that at high altitudes there were air currents blowing directly from Japan towards America, jet streams. They decided to utilize these as a free transport system for death. They crafted 9,000 enormous balloons out of paper, ordinary mulberry paper. 9,000. They filled them with hydrogen and attached incendiary and shrapnel bombs before releasing them into the sky. This marked the first instance of intercontinental weaponry in history. No engines, no pilots. Just physics and a hope for luck. Balloons were supposed to fly 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, descend over the forests of the United States, and ignite massive fires. Panic, chaos, and the diversion of forces from the front lines. This was the plan. And the strangest part? It worked. Balloons started to be discovered all over America, in Wyoming, Montana, and even in Canada. One of them got entangled in power lines and temporarily shut down the plant that produced components for the first atomic bomb. The United States government was horrified at the thought of the Japanese attaching biological weapons to these balloons, anthrax, plague, to which they had no immediate defense. Thus, officials made a decision that now seems unfathomable. They implemented complete and total censorship. Not a single line in the newspapers, not a word on the radio. Americans found debris from the balloons in fields and brought it to their sheriffs, who would say, "This is just debris from weather balloons, forget about it." Curious minds were left in the dark, while the press remained silent. The Japanese listened to American radio. They waited for news of the fires. They anticipated chaos. But the airwaves were silent. Not a mention. A month passed, then 2, and then 3, leading Tokyo to conclude that the project had failed. No balloon made it to its destination. They figured their idea was a bust and shut down the program, having launched only around 1,000 balloons from the planned tens of thousands. Silence saved thousands of lives, yet it also took the life of Pastor Mitchell's family. Had they known that Japanese mines could be lurking in the woods, they would have never approached that balloon. It's a horrifying dilemma. The truth that could provoke panic, or the lie that protects the nation but leaves innocent people vulnerable. Archie Mitchell could never reconcile this. He disappeared a few years later, lost somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It is said he sought answers to questions that no one wanted to provide. This story exemplifies how silence can be as powerful a weapon as gunpowder, and how we sometimes find ourselves at the epicenter of events we are unaware of. Interestingly, remnants of those balloons are still found in the forests of America today. 80 years later, they lie there, covered in moss, still capable of causing harm. In this case, nature became an unwitting accomplice of mankind. However, in the next story, humans will try to play God by creating something that alters the very essence of life, all stemming from a single small mistake in a laboratory. This is story number 23. Reign of 8 tons of unfulfilled hopes. Have you ever noticed that engineering can possess one strange trait? Sometimes it becomes overly grandiose. You know when, instead of picking up a small shovel, a person grabs a crate of dynamite and says, "Look how I'll solve this all in one go." Frankly, during such moments, common sense typically takes a smoke break and doesn't return. What happened in November 1970 in the state of Oregon is a perfect testament to this. Picture a beach in the town of Florence, along the coast of the ocean. It's beautiful, noisy, fragrant with salt, and amidst this idyllic scene lies a mountain. More specifically, the carcass of a sperm whale washed ashore, measuring 14 meters long and weighing 8 tons of decaying flesh. Within a couple of days, the stench became so overwhelming that seagulls began to circle the beach in large arcs. The local residents pinched their noses while city officials frantically pondered what to do next. Bury it? That wouldn't work. The tides would simply wash it away. Cut it into pieces and haul it off? Nobody wanted to get their hands dirty with this disaster. At that moment, George Thornton, an engineer from the highway department and a man of action, stepped up. He inspected the dead whale, squinting thoughtfully, and proposed a brilliant idea. Let's blow it up. After all, why not? The logic was solid. We would place dynamite on one side of the carcass. Boom! A massive wave of energy would eliminate the whale, or at the very least, shatter it into tiny fragments that would be swiftly cleared away by crabs and seagulls. Clean, quick, and effective. On November 15th, a crowd gathered on the shore. Journalists with cameras, families with children. Everyone was eager for the spectacle. George Thornton, like a true champion, ordered 20 boxes of dynamite to be placed under the whale, nearly 1,000 pounds of explosives. An experienced military man, who happened to be in the audience, approached the engineer and whispered, "Buddy, that's too much. A couple of charges would suffice." "You're just going to?" But George wasn't listening. He believed in the power of progress. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know, the video footage from that day shows a giant, truly epic column of sand, smoke, and something red shooting up into the sky. It looked like the launch of a space rocket. The crowd gasped in awe. However, within a second, the gasp turned into a scream of terror as what went up began to come back down. But these weren't tiny pieces for crabs. They were enormous, heavy, slippery chunks of whale blubber the size of bedside tables, falling straight towards the spectators. Imagine standing 400 feet from the explosion, enjoying life, only to have a 20-kilogram piece of whale plummet from the sky toward you. Chaos ensued. People rushed towards their cars, shielding their heads with their hands. A hail of rotting flesh rained down on the parking lot. One massive chunk, soaring in a perfect parabola, landed directly on the roof of a brand-new Oldsmobile, crushing it into a metallic pancake. The car's owner, who had come to enjoy the show, stood frozen with his mouth agape. The vehicle was completely wrecked. And what about the whale? When the smoke cleared, it became evident that most of the carcass remained where it was. The explosion merely created a vast pit beneath it and scattered the surrounding area with a sticky layer of rancid blubber. The seagulls, which Thornton had relied upon, fled in terror and didn't return for days. They were likely stunned as well. The engineer had to quickly adapt amidst the rain of curses and decaying detritus. Ultimately, they ended up having to bury the whale by hand, using the very method that had initially seemed too time-consuming. This incident became a legend, teaching us that sometimes the simplest solution is merely an illusion. And if you decide to tackle a problem with dynamite, be prepared for it to return to you in the form of 8 tons of blubber rain. By the way, that Oldsmobile made its mark in advertising history. Its owner later tried for a long time to claim insurance for the damage caused by the whale. But while human folly led to this farce, the next story involves a single person's mistake transforming a routine trip into a nightmare that lasted for years. And there were no explosions, only the quiet rustle of snow and utter solitude. Case number 24. Photographs from the Kingdom of the Dead. Have you ever contemplated what oblivion looks like? Not the kind described in books, but the real thing. When you slip into the void, and the world erases your name from the lists of the living for decades. Silence, cold, and a complete absence of answers. To be honest, we are accustomed to thinking that if someone goes missing, there will at least be some traces left behind. But the Arctic? It does not favor leaving traces. It prefers to store them in the freezer, ready to unveil the truth to those who no longer await it. July 1897. The island of Svalbard. 3 men stand in the basket of a massive balloon known as the Eagle. Their leader, Solomon André, a Swedish engineer, a man with a steely gaze and, frankly, a rather perilous dream. He has determined that he will reach the North Pole in this silk bubble filled with hydrogen. Imagine it, the end of the 19th century. Radio? Non-existent. Navigation by stars and compass. The balloon is steered solely by the wind and long ropes trailing over the ice. It's madness, of course, yet the crowd on the shore is cheering. André waves his hat, the ropes are cut, and the Eagle slowly vanishes into the gray northern mist. 3 days later, the balloon disappears. A year passes. 5, 10. The world has witnessed the First World War. Empires have collapsed. Radio, airplanes, and television have been invented. and not a single word has been heard about Solomon Andre and his companions Niels Strandberg and Knut Frankel. They have become ghosts, legends of men who flew into the sky and never returned. But the Arctic knows how to wait. August 1930. 33 years have passed. 33. The vessel Bratvak unintentionally approaches the uninhabited White Island. It is a chunk of rock covered by a glacier, seldom visited by humans. The sailors land on the shore and discover an aluminum boat protruding from the snow, alongside skeletons, remnants of a camp, mildew-covered diaries, and a few rusty metal canisters. Inside those canisters were photographic films. Listen, that's remarkable. The films had been submerged in icy water beneath snow and wind for 33 years. Any photographer would tell you that this is a death sentence. The emulsion should have turned to mush, but the cold acted as a perfect preservative. When they were brought to Stockholm and handed over to specialists, silence descended in the laboratory. Chemists worked their magic on the reagents, and slowly, millimeter by millimeter, outlines began to emerge from oblivion. The world witnessed what transpired after the eagle disappeared into the fog. It turned out that the balloon managed to stay aloft for only 65 hours. It froze, became too heavy, and fell onto the ice. The three men found themselves in the middle of an endless icy wasteland. In the photographs, they appear serene. Here they are, standing against the backdrop of the fallen balloon. Here they are, pulling heavy sleds across ridges. In one of the images, Strandberg is even smiling next to a shot polar bear. They walked for 3 months. They walked toward land, battling the drift of the ice that constantly swept them back north. They reached White Island, set up a tent, and fell silent. The most haunting aspect of these images is their ordinariness. These are not heroic poses from paintings. These are simply individuals who are aware of their impending death, but still continue to press the shutter to capture their final journey. They filmed one another as their strength began to wane. Do you realize what is most ironic about this? They were discovered at a time when technology had progressed so far that their balloon flight appeared to be child's play. Yet, these revealed snapshots brought them back to reality. They ceased to be legends and transformed back into living, breathing individuals made of flesh, blood, and fear. This is a tale about how nothing ever truly vanishes without a trace. Time can freeze like ice, but eventually it must thaw. And then the past will gaze directly into our eyes through the lens of an old camera. However, sometimes what we discover in the past is not merely memories. It serves as a warning that even the most noble intentions can lead to the ground beneath us igniting in flames, a fire that no ocean on Earth can extinguish. Story number 25. The Dragon That Should Not Have Been Teased. Listen, have you ever played with something that you absolutely should not? You know, it's that moment when your inner voice whispers, "Don't touch it, it's dangerous," yet you still reach out. Honestly, each of us has had that experience in our childhood. But when you are a grown scientist in a secret laboratory in Los Alamos, holding the heart of an atomic bomb, the price of curiosity becomes, shall we say, final. On the 21st of May, 1946, New Mexico. The war had already ended. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were now history. In the laboratory, there remained a small metallic sphere, weighing 6 kilograms of pure plutonium. It was named Rufus. It was intended for the third bomb that was never dropped. The scientists of Los Alamos were brilliant individuals, but, to be honest, completely reckless. They conducted experiments to determine critical mass. This was called teasing the dragon's tail. Why? Because you're balancing on the very edge of nuclear explosion. The main tamer that day was Louis Slotin, an exceptional physicist and risk-taker who always wore cowboy boots and blue jeans. He had performed this experiment dozens of times. Imagine, on the table lies this plutonium sphere. Slotin covers it with a beryllium hemisphere, a metal that reflects neutrons back into the core. If the sphere were to be fully enclosed, a chain reaction would commence, a flash. Death. To prevent this, a tiny gap must be left between the hemispheres. Slotin had his own method. No automatic clamps, no safety devices. He simply inserted a standard flat screwdriver between the metal halves and held it with his hand, adjusting the gap visibly by mere millimeters. There were 7 other individuals in the room. They were watching. Silence. Only the dry crackle of Geiger counters, which became progressively quicker. Tick, 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 tick. Then Slotin's hand trembled. The ordinary kitchen screwdriver slipped out. The upper hemisphere fell onto the plutonium. The gap vanished. In that instant, the room was flooded with a blinding, otherworldly light. A blue flash. The air instantly turned sharp, metallic, with a taste of ozone. Slotin felt a wave of heat on his face. It wasn't fire. It was radiation. The dragon had awakened. Do you know what Slotin did at that moment? He had a fraction of a second. He could have run away, could have dropped to the floor, but instead, he seized the scorching upper hemisphere with his bare hands and yanked it upward. He ruptured the critical mass. He halted the reaction. The Geiger counters went off the charts and then fell silent. They burned out. Slotin straightened himself. He was calm. He glanced at his colleagues who stood in shock and quietly said, "Well, that's it." He understood. He had absorbed a dose of 1,000 rads. This was a death sentence. No alternatives. He scrawled a diagram on the board indicating where everyone was standing, so the medical team would know how much radiation the others had been exposed to. He lived for 9 days. These were 9 days of hell, which I won't elaborate on since I promised to spare the gruesome details. Let's just say that his body began to disintegrate at an atomic level, but he saved those 7. They survived because he did not let go of that sphere. Rufus was subsequently given a new name. He was dubbed the Demonic Core. No one dared approach it with a screwdriver ever again. Soon enough, it was melted down and transformed into other parts to erase all memory of the metal that had killed people twice during peacetime. This is a story about how even the sharpest mind cannot guard against folly, and how sometimes a moment's recklessness can cost an entire life. But while here, a man attempted to tame the unseen power of the atom, in the next story, humans confronted a force that could be touched, a force that emerged from the depths of the ages and was so immense that merely seeing it made entire cities believe in the apocalypse or in gods who had chosen to return to Earth. A man who deceived lead. Have you ever pondered how many bullets it takes to stop a person? Truth be told, films often show that one is enough, but reality is far more ironic and terrifying than any Hollywood action flick. In this tale, there were 9. 9 pieces of lead meant to put an end to a life, but instead only added a pause. March 1915. Mexico. Revolution. Dust. The smell of gunpowder and cheap tequila. In this chaos, a human life was worth less than a glass of water. Venceslao Miguel was a young man, a soldier stationed on the wrong side. On an unfortunate day, he was captured without trial. Without formalities, he was sentenced to execution. A common occurrence for that time,